G'day, May 40 here. So, wasn't it this kind of mess that got Donald Trump elected in 2016, almost got him re-elected in 2020, and then finally elected again in 2024? It's this American carnage. It's the return of American carnage. It's the return of terror from people subscribing to Islam, and it's the disruption and terror wrought by Black Lives Matter. And so we get the return of Donald Trump to clean up this mess. You'd have to think that this latest terror attack makes it more likely that Donald Trump gets his nominees through, such as Kash Patel. Where have American law enforcement been focusing their efforts under Joe Biden? They've been focusing their efforts on the threat of white nationalism, the January 6th rioters, angry parents at school board meetings where they're protesting about COVID lockdown policies, Catholics who are against abortion. This is where the Biden administration has put its focus. It's interesting that there is great reluctance on the part of Democrats to talk about the threat of Islamic terrorism when Islamic terrorism is a real threat that has caused considerable disruption. Our lives are just being turned upside down by the threat of Islamic terror. Traveling on an airplane, just so much more difficult now because of the threat of Islamic terror. And I don't notice Republicans, by and large, having a problem with talking about the threat from white nationalists. There is a threat from some white nationalists, and there is an Islamic terror threat. They're both real, and it's not necessarily clear which year, which ideology will kill the most people. But there's something about the Democrats just have an extreme reluctance to talk about Islamic terror. And there are some Republicans who don't want to talk about white nationalist terror. But I think most Americans who think about it will recognize, yes, there is a real threat from some parts of Islam, and there is a real threat from white nationalism and black nationalism. The terror that Black Lives Matter put tens of millions of Americans through, just disrupted life, delayed commutes, made millions of people feel unsafe. You had a massive explosion in crime, a massive explosion in bad behavior after the death of George Floyd. Right? Massive increase in murder, massive increase in driving deaths, pedestrian deaths. We had a massive boost in the deaths from exuberance. And the Democratic Party and the mainstream media and even many conventional Republicans were all on board with Black Lives Matter, which was a terrorist organization. Black Lives Matter comes to our attention when they're out there committing acts of terror. And then when you had that Black Lives Matter supporter who went out and shot and killed 5 policemen in Dallas, Texas in the summer of 2016, that was the moment that Steve Saylor said, wow, I think Donald Trump is going to win this election. There should be no hesitancy at pointing out the threat to America and the threat to the West from Islamic terror. It's considerable. It's gone on for 6 decades now. It has been the cause of almost all of our airplane hijackings over the past 50 years. And if you can't talk about Islamic terror, and you can't plan for Islamic terror, and you can't put law enforcement resources into Islamic terror, if you can't name the problem, right, then you're probably not going to be very effective with negotiating the problem. Here's John Podhoretz of Commentary Magazine and the rest of his
seriousness, but a genuine desire to pretend that the threat that is posed by Islamism doesn't really exist because.
And it's just so incredibly awkward for the Democratic political coalition, right? The only thing that holds together the Democratic political coalition is hatred of white men in particular, hatred of the white Christian majority in the United States. That loathing is the only thing that the coalition of the fringe has in common, right? Otherwise, they just hate each other. Particular. And so this Islamic terror attack is very inconvenient for the Democratic Party political coalition, very inconvenient for the news media. The news media tends to feel absolutely giddy at the prospect of focusing on white nationalist terror, anti-Islamic terror. Right? That makes the news media absolutely giddy to focus there, but extreme reluctance to talk about the threat of Islamic terror. How many stories have you seen over the past 6 years about the threat of Islamic terror compared to the threat of white nationalist terror? As I record news media coverage, it's about 20-1 about the threat of white nationalist terror, and extreme reluctance by the mainstream media to even talk about a category called Islamic terror. That it's somehow Islamic phobic to simply notice that many of the people committing the most horrific acts of terror in the Western world over the past 6 decades have been Muslims, often displaying signs of high intensity devotion to Islam. This seems to drive most terror in the West over the past 6 decades. And yet the news media, our elites, our law enforcement elites, our Democratic Party elites, our cultural elites, our academic elites do not want to talk about the threat of Islamic terror. It's just a bold-faced denial of reality, and reality is always going to win, right? Reality is like the crazy, nasty honey badger.
It's the honey badger. Watch it run in slow motion. It's pretty badass. Look, it runs all over the place. Whoa, watch out, says that bird. Ew, it's got a snake. Oh, it's chasing a jackal. Oh my gosh. Oh, the honey badgers are just crazy. The honey badger has been referred to by the Guinness Book of World Records as the most fearless animal in all of the animal kingdom. It really doesn't give a shit. If it's hungry, it's hungry. Ew, what's that in its mouth? Oh, it's got a cobra. Oh, it runs backwards. Now watch this. Look, a snake's up in the tree. Honey badger don't care. Honey badger don't give a shit. It just takes what it wants. Whenever it's hungry, it just, ew, and it eats snake.
So I was reading some essays by David Gorski today, the surgeon, and he talked about the reality is the crazy, nasty honey badger. And you can't wish it away.
Snakes? Oh my god, watch it dig. Look at that digging. The honey badger is really pretty badass. They have no regard for any other animal whatsoever. Look, and it's just grunting and ew, eating snakes. Ew, what's that, a mouse? Oh, that's nasty. Oh, they're so nasty. Ooh, look, it's chasing things and eating them. The honey badgers have a fairly long body, but a distinctly thick set, broad shoulders, and, you know, their skin is loose, allowing them to move about freely.
Right, here's John Podhoretz.
Because it's extremely inconvenient for, I think, the larger Democratic political coalition, which wants to think that 9/11 was a one-off, which doesn't want to be involved in fighting against Islamism outside our borders, and doesn't want to think that Islamism is a problem inside.
Right, Democrats, by and large, would rather focus their ire on the Jewish state. They'd rather hate on Israel than talk about the threat from Islamic terror.
Our borders. And
I think we should also bring into this what's been going on for more than a year now in the U.S., with namely the woke jihad and the Tentifada terrorist supporters, right? The very phenomenon itself, the fact that there are thousands of people out there chanting, Americans chanting, globalize the Intifada, and holding up jihad signs outside of the White House, shows how thoroughly we have gotten out of the mindset that this is a real threat that is active against the U.S.
And the worst thing about these Islamic terror attacks is, imagine if people start talking about them and identify them and put a label on them, such as Islamic terror attack. Just think about the backlash to the Muslim community. That's the biggest threat here. The honey badger takes what it wants. It doesn't care, right? The strong take what they want, and the weak endure what they must. Does the United States of America want to be strong, or does it want to be weak? Does it want to keep taking these blows, or does it want to start doing something about it?
It's like they the pro-Hamas crowd, the pro-terrorist crowd, have existed in a different universe entirely, but we're still in this universe. And I think one of the things we may see as a result of this is taking those people a lot more seriously, meaning not giving them their photo op 2 hours in jail and then scrubbed from their record. I think this is among other things, a reminder that when you have hordes of Americans out there chanting on behalf of America-hating terrorists, it's a really, really big national security problem.
I just want to add, by the way, to that point, is that we're also getting a lot of information out of the UK's grooming scandal. And one of the pieces of information, not to switch topics, but one of the pieces of information in the investigation was that investigators were worried about the racism that would come from busting grooming gangs, essentially, right? These were mostly Pakistani grooming gangs. So that is part of something that we have to live with daily, which is this idea that they're going to tell us what they think.
We're not able to effectively combat this terror because people are afraid to call it what it is, Islamic terror. And we had Islamic grooming gangs, Pakistani grooming gangs. You're not going to be able to confront, not going to be able to deal with something like this unless you're able to name it and place the blame correctly where it belongs.
We are capable of knowing without being mean to each other. And then that line stops the flow of information.
And so the
fear of being seen as Islamophobic on the left is greater than the fear they should have about Islamic terrorism. That's just simply, unfortunately, the case.
And, getting to the famous line of the last 8-9 years, which is that's how you got Trump, it is the effort to suppress conversation about things that are going on in front of people's faces that leads people to say, I cannot trust what's coming out of the mouths of the people in government. I cannot trust what the press is covering. I know that they have another agenda. What happened with Trump in the wake of the Pulse shooting and stuff like that is it was in the wake of the Pulse shooting that Trump said, we need to have a complete shutdown, right, of all immigration until we can figure out what the hell is going on. The Pope attacked him.
Right, the FBI is telling us absolutely no link between the New Orleans attack and the attack in Las Vegas. Right, these two terrorists were both at the same army base. Right, it's highly unlikely that there is no connection. So the FBI, which couldn't figure out why you had that mass shooting at the country music festival, they seem to be doing a pretty shoddy job in reaction to these latest terror attacks. I was looking at this journalist who saw just traipsing through the home of the New Orleans terrorist. The FBI had gone through briefly, took a few things, but left most troubling things behind. So maybe, my God, maybe Kash Patel, maybe someone like that is what we need for the FBI. My God.
Of the press, everybody attacked him. And I'm not saying that what he said was right, but it was a response to the real thing that happened, while the official line was that the thing that had happened hadn't really happened or was something else. We were being gaslighted about Islamic terrorism.
I have to say, though, to me, it is remarkable how quickly the FBI backed off its initial politically correct. Let's not call it.
Because they found the flag in the truck.
It was impossible to ignore within an hour. And there was also, of course, the New Orleans authorities, coming from.
And just pulled up the platform X, semi-tweets. I don't care what side of politics you're on. Every single person should be focused on protecting children that have and are being groomed, abused, raped, tortured, trafficked, and murdered by Pakistani grooming gangs. At a sexual assault trial of one young Pakistani male, his counsel said he'd been taught that white girls were like a piece of chewing gum on the road. Right? These grooming gangs just have a murderous hatred for white females. But that kind of hatred, right, that's a much more socially acceptable form of hatred.
From a region of the country that does not subscribe in general to these pieties, they did not echo the initial FBI line. They said, it looks like there could be some terrorist indications pretty quickly on. And so by the time you did get Biden's evening statement, even he was willing to say on the record that the terrorist was inspired by ISIS. We're not clear what that means or whether there were any communications yet, but at least Biden was willing to put that on board. That to me was pretty remarkable, in contrast to the pattern that you lay out during the Obama era, where it was maddening and gaslighting in terms of downplaying the Islamic content of terrorist attack after terrorist attack.
And again, let's go back
Can I
to
just
that.
add one more wrinkle to that, which is something that both the right and the left should be able to come to some agreement on as an area of concern, is that both of these men were Army vets. The one in the little we found out so far about the Cybertruck bomb in Las Vegas, this guy was a special ops vet. So there's something going on in our military that we're going to have to discuss in terms of people who might have been radicalized while within an institution that's actually formed to protect American citizens. And again, we have very early information about what happened in Las Vegas. But if there's radicalization going on within the military, that's something that I think both the left and the right can come together and say, well, this is bad. Let's figure out what's happening here.
Well, they can't, because we've been through in the past few years, we've seen that the establishment is happy to talk about extremism and radicalization in the military, because they're very worried about a white nationalist problem in the U.S. military. And I'm not saying there aren't such problems. As John said before, there are, these gangs. Sometimes we see the feds in a standoff out in Wyoming or wherever with these things exist. They both exist. But we have been talking about, sort of exclusively white nationalist radicalization in the U.S. military. And that then has this effect of putting the right a bit on the defensive and saying, well, what about this? What about that? And the numbers don't show it to really be a crisis. And you're only focusing on that. And it begins to sound a bit like some of the social experimentation and wokeism complaints about the military, too. And it gets subsumed into the larger conversation. So unfortunately, I don't know that we can have that sort of national conversation.
I think Pete Hegseth will have that conversation.
Yeah, I think he will.
He will try. Secretary of Defense. And I think the terrorist attack makes it more likely that Hegseth becomes Secretary of Defense.
Look, back to that's how you got Trump, okay? Now let's move on. Let's just remember where Hillary Clinton was in 2012, 2013 versus where she ended up, right? She retired as Secretary of State with a 65% approval rating. What was it that took her down over the course of the 2 years before Trump even came in?
Benghazi.
It was Benghazi. Why did the administration respond to the killing of 4 embassy personnel, including our ambassador in Benghazi, the way that it responded? Because Obama was running for re-election, and they had devised this line. And the line was, bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive. Saying, oh my God, you know what? Islamic terrorism remains a huge problem and we need to combat it. Seemed like a no-brainer to me. It's good to be hawkish when you're running for re-election. I would think you'd want to say, I'm tough. I'm going to
Didn't he call ISIS the JV team or something like that?
That was later.
That was later. That was 2013.
John, I'm going to say our trademark phrase for the first time in 2025. But it's worse than that, because not only did they downplay the Islamic content or terrorism,
How many leading Republican politicians are strongly invested in downplaying white nationalist terrorism? Very few. Most Republican politicians are quite happy to say that there's a problem when there's obviously a problem, but very few Democrats are willing to say we've got a problem with Islam, that we have way too much danger and disruption to our way of life caused by Islamic terrorism.
refused to call it terrorism, as was famously debated that year. The administration blamed it on America by saying that ridiculous movie that somehow they kind of plucked out of thin air and described it. So what was malevolent about Obama in retrospect was it wasn't just willful blindness. It was in a blame America first attitude,
right?
Even when we were the victims,
right? Now, but I'm only bringing this up.
And why do they want to blame America first? Because there is a particular prestige with this way of thinking that by looking at your own side and how you are at fault, that really only white people have agency, and anything horrible done by brown and black people, that is the fault of white people. It just shows how morally developed you are. Right? This is the outlook that dominates many, if not most, of our institutions, dominates academia, dominates much of the news media and the education industrial complex, that the way you demonstrate your morality is by denying agency to those who are not white and by claiming that white people are responsible for all the ills in the world.
Not because I want to relitigate, how Obama was bad and all of that. I'm saying if Democrats are looking to get back in the game in the United States after this election, and I'm not saying that the Democratic Party is the respondent yesterday in the way this was all covered, but they better not go back to this. They better be part of the conversation.
I mean, what kind of person denies that we have a problem with parts of Islam? What kind of person denies that Donald Trump's idea of barring immigration from 7 countries that supply an awful large amount of Islamic terror, and therefore we should stop allowing these people entrance to our country? What kind of person denies these basic commonsensical steps to identify the problem and to protect America from the problem?
Conversation about threats to the United States from Islamic terrorism, threats to the United States at the border, from an open border, from people crossing who are not only just crossing from Mexico or from El Salvador or from Guatemala, but seem to be flying to Central and South America to get to the border to cross over. If they pretend that this is not happening, they are only going to ballast the republic.
Perhaps it's a bad idea to have open borders. Perhaps it's a bad idea not to be able to control the type of people who come into our country. Look at how much havoc this one man did in New Orleans. Right? One person can disrupt life for hundreds of thousands of law-abiding citizens. Right? The ability of one person to create havoc is just so much larger normally than the ability of one person to do some good.
Total Republican conservative domination of the conversation about what threatens the United States domestically in terms of crime and terrorism. And this should be a no-brainer, and it is not a no-brainer for them. And that is where I think Christine's right, that they have a colossal conceptual vocabulary problem.
Look, there is much in Islamic history that Muslims should be quite proud of. Islam has had some substantial contributions, but not lately. Right? Honestly, in the last, 300 years, Islamic civilization has not really amounted to much. I can't think of any country that you can point to in the Western world where you'd say, oh, they had this large influx of immigrants, and now look how much more free and prosperous and more cohesive they are, how much higher social trust. There may be such countries. Tell me about them. Like, lay out for me the countries that have been radically improved by the large-scale import of Islamic immigrants. The 3 million Middle East immigrants that Germany took in have, on average, according to new academic studies, about a standard deviation lower in IQ than your average German. That means that they're very likely to be taking out far more in welfare payments than they're going to ever contribute to the tax base. Also, lower IQ people tend to commit a lot more crime, right? They tend to be a major drag on society. So why would any nation want to import a forever underclass? You don't have many examples of which I'm aware where you massively import large numbers of people with an IQ score in the 70s or in the 80s. And then they turn around and within 3 generations, they now average an IQ score of 100, right? We don't have any examples of that. So why would any first world nation want to import in a forever underclass? Not forever in the sense that it is now determined that this will inevitably last forever with that particular class. Forever in the sense that all the information we have to date, we don't have any evidence of any group showing an average IQ in the 70s ever turning it around and upping it by 2 standard deviations to the European norm of 100.
Simply going where I don't even understand why it's so hard to go there.
There was also a moment in Biden's statement last night that was, darkly humorous, because toward the end of it, after again, I give him credit. He said, look, this was a terrorist attack, clearly inspired by ISIS. We're trying to figure things out. He then goes, when I get the information, I'll be completely transparent with you. Now, think about that for a second. The man who hid his condition from the public for 4 years, promising radical transparency. This is part of the problem.
Yeah, with 18 days to go.
Yeah, 18 days to go with, the Carter funeral, the trip to the Vatican. Apparently, he's handing out presidential medals of freedom just today, as we in a few hours. Yeah, but
some
he's
kind of medal. It's not the medal. Yeah, but but
it's like the bobblehead night at baseball stadiums. By the way, the first like 40,000 people who show up to the White House today get the medal.
No, the bobblehead were the commutations. That was bobblehead, right? As long as you were in the stadium, you got your sentence commuted, no matter what no matter if you were throwing kids into reform schools or you killed mothers with machetes or whatever.
Or murdering children, as some of the other people.
Murdering children, yes.
Yes.
But I want to, one of your persistent themes, or one of our main conversations here, and we're only months from the Butler 1/10.
So the big problem when it's socially unacceptable to talk about Islamic terror is that only people who are at ease with being socially marginalized will talk about it. And a lot of these people are really awful people. Right here is the parent of a grooming gang victim in the UK detailing how Tommy Robinson's right-hand man, Danny, plied his daughter with drink and drugs to have sex with her while Tommy was filming his Rape of Britain documentary series.
My daughter...
The whole of the Tommy team absolutely fucking hate Danny Tomo.
They do now, yeah.
Because they know what some of the things he's done. All the women especially hate him.
It was. It came to light that my daughter, who was a survivor, when he met my daughter, who was working in my office at the time, the minute he met her, he started texting her all the time, continually texting her. She went down, she drove herself down to his place, and then apparently him and his mate were there just doing coke all night.
Yeah. No surprise.
Nurse her into bed.
Yeah.
Going to my daughter, that I don't know. But
groomed, simply groomed.
Yeah, and they're all at it.
Yeah.
The whole of the Tommy team.
So anyone decent has to stay away from these decadent, crummy people, whether they're on the right or the left.
When the grooming scandal hit, there's a Sikh organisation called Sikh Awareness Society who have for 20 years, 30 years, longer than I have, they were on this grooming issue. They've relocated 10 girls abroad to save them, and they don't just deal with Sikh girls. They're a fabulous organisation. Look them up. In fact, the man who runs them, his name's Mohan Singh. I first went to a Luton Sikh temple to listen to him speak about grooming, and he carried an aura that I've never experienced. When I listened to him talk, I thought, wow, he's a religious man, and there was something very special about him and the way he spoke and the connection he had with everyone. And then I travelled the country, going to Hindu temples and Sikh temples to listen and learn about how they're tackling the grooming issue and what they're doing. And I remember the journalist asked me, I brought a journalist, and he said, what do you think of what's happening here? I said, it's absolutely brilliant for the Sikhs and for the Hindus. Who's doing this for us? Who's educating the white? Because in these temples, they have all the mums and the sisters and the daughters, and they're all sat down. And then they give them a seminar for 2 hours. And they show them, this is how they groom you. This is what to expect. This is how they operate. Yeah. So all the warning signs, the families can see the warning signs. No one's doing that for us. So I remember looking, thinking, this is great, but I felt so disheartened that the working class, the white working class, are still being targeted. There's no one helping us. And then when the grooming scandal come out, who did the government fund? They funded all the Muslim taxis, and they funded all the Muslim groups. They give them all government funding to report and tackle grooming. The Sikh groups or the other groups, they've never received any support in this. They do it through their own community donations. Now, Sikh Awareness was viewed pretty much similar as English Fence League. Oh, you're blaming it on the Muslims because of historical problems in India. Yeah. But when the Rotherham scandal broke and the cat got out of the bag with the world and the media, people realised they were telling the truth.
So there are a lot of white men out there recruiting women into sex work. I reported on the sex industry for a decade, and there were blokes who would specialize in getting women into the pornography industry, into prostitution, into stripping, right? So it's not as though this is just a uniquely Pakistani problem, but when you've got a problem, you have to begin by naming it. I love labels when labels are accurate. Labels make the world more clear. They make our thinking more clear. They facilitate better solutions, right? You can't come up with solutions unless you're able to state what's going on with as much clarity as possible.
1/10 of a second and Trump would be dead assassination attempt, about which we know nothing, right? We know nothing about the Mandalay Bay Country Music Festival shooter or shooting. This is a persistent theme on the podcast that we don't get to the bottom.
We don't get answers.
And if we don't get to the bottom of Sham Jabbar and the guy with the Cybertruck, again, the amount of leeway that is going to give the relatively radical agenda of Pam Bondi, the incoming Attorney General, and Kash Patel, who I believe.
And I'm not awesome here. I reported on Ron Jeremy for years. I was on friendly terms with Ron Jeremy, and I'd read Jerry Butler's autobiography. Jerry Butler was a male porn performer who wrote in his book how Ron Jeremy would force himself sexually on women. And so that was kind of around. People knew it, but none of us talked about Ron Jeremy being a rapist until Ginger Lynn came out and said it in an interview in 2006, 2007. So I was right there. It was, Ron Jeremy was doing his thing, but none of the people I talked to said, "Oh, Ron Jeremy's a rapist," but he was a rapist. It was there in Jerry Butler's book, which was published in something like 1992, and I read it, and I believe I quoted it. I sure hope I quoted it in my Ron Jeremy profile, but I was also writing about Hollywood, and we knew that Harvey Weinstein was just an awful person, including with the way he treated women. But that story was going on all around me. I didn't break that story. I didn't break the Ron Jeremy rapist story. So sometimes these stories of terrible sexual abuse are going on around me, and I've either got a blind spot, or sometimes I just don't have the courage or the energy to go after these stories.
Now, I don't know how he's not going to get confirmed as FBI director after. What is he going to seem too tough to be FBI director? And Pete Hegseth, right? Precisely because of the military, the questions relating to the military that Matt raises and all of that, they're going to have a freer hand than people realize. And particularly if you have civil libertarian concerns about an overly active federal government pursuing aims and ends, you have to be part of a rational discussion of what is going on, and not just saying, "Oh, you're all just a bunch of racists or Islamophobes."
If you're going to do a podcast about the news or about society, yeah, you should optimize for truth. And there is an Islamic terror threat, and it's important to point that out. On the other hand, you should not only optimize for truth, you should optimize for your own well-being. So there are going to be all sorts of truths that you cannot say out loud explicitly. So you need to use euphemisms, or you're going to lack energy, you're going to lack the strength, you're going to lack the income or the psychological reserves or the financial reserves or the social reserves sometimes to tackle difficult topics. So optimize for truth, but don't burn your life down. Recognize your own humanity, your own vulnerability. But as much as possible, if you're going to talk about public affairs, you should try to talk about it in as explicitly in your language as you can, and not burn down your own life, and not cause havoc to your family and to your friends and to your community. Right? We all have family, we all have friends, we all have community, we all have vulnerabilities. Some people are going to be much more free to speak out explicitly about some things, but with regard to Islamic terror, the starting point is say there's a problem with Islamic terror in the United States and throughout the First World. And we also should be able to say that Islamic civilization has had many high points, but it's been in a downward spiral for approximately 300 years.
Or whatever.
Here's my, it's worse than that. It's not only that we don't get answers and that information is potentially being withheld from us. I think a lot of the times we don't get answers because an administration like this one, they don't know the answers.
Well, I hope they don't know the answers.
No, but I mean,
in a weird way, I hope that's true, because you don't want them to know and not tell, right? I mean, that would be even worse.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what's worse. Okay, because there are national security things that the government shouldn't share publicly, and there's some that they should. But whether or not terrorism is homegrown, not homegrown, if they think that that the guy in New Orleans had accomplices, Who are those accomplices? Are those accomplices foreign? Some of them, maybe. I don't know. I don't want to speculate. But I do know that we've had an if they are, from where? There are figures in the Pentagon who have been sounding the alarm for months, saying we don't have eyes and ears in Afghanistan anymore at all.
I've read 30 news media stories about the white nationalist problem in the American armed forces. I don't recall many stories about the Islamic terror problem in American armed forces. Remember, early on in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, you had an American Muslim soldier who purposely set off a hand grenade in a tent, injuring, devastating, possibly killing many of his fellow soldiers.
We have an administration that has been trying to reignite a nuclear deal with Iran, as opposed to seeing them as the very serious adversary they are. Our whole national security footing needs to be changed. It doesn't have to look exactly like it did during the Bush years, but there has been such an easing up.
It's incredible that we have massively increased Islamic immigration since 9/11. Why? Why, after 9/11, did we think it was a great idea to increase immigration, period, let alone massively increase Islamic immigration, including many people who hate us and want us dead?
On the gas pedal, in terms of protecting the homeland, that we have to enter a whole new paradigm again. People don't want it, but it's inevitable.
And to Abe's earlier point about the student Tentifada group, there actually is something there that I think would resonate with the American people that is not reactionary, but practical. And that's to say, if you're here on a foreign student visa and you're calling for the destruction of this country, you should leave. We will send you home. And there are plenty of people who could take their spots at these elite colleges and institutions who don't have those beliefs. So I think that looking at, and we're not going to get into the visa debate that's going on currently within the Republican Party, but there are actually practical, immediate steps that can be taken to de-radicalize some of the places.
And again, that person, by the way, we had a case where we had an actual case where a person would have, Christine, right, lost their scholarship or their student visa, whatever it is that they were on, and they were not punished.
I think it was at MIT,
because they would have probably had to have been.
Right. Many of our academic elites, cultural elites, many of the most powerful people in this country want to bend over backwards to give second chances to Muslims who are intent on committing terror against Americans. Let's get a burst here from Fox News.
Anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay. I will defend our interests and our people with every measure at my command.
Biden may only have a few weeks left in office, but his disastrous policies will leave America reeling for years to come. We're already seeing the effects in real time. Check this out. A new report from Axios details how our adversaries in the Middle East have only gotten stronger in recent years. Quote, Iran's nuclear program has advanced dramatically during Biden's time in office, bringing Iran to the status of a de facto nuclear threshold state. Wow. And now that half, the White House is already boxed up. He's reportedly considering preemptive strikes against Iran. Now, this is the last thing that America needs, especially if it's President Joe Biden overseeing them. Just remember Afghanistan. Does he just want to mess with what's left before Trump heads into office? And that's a real question. Former National Security Advisor to President Trump and America First Policy Institute Chairman, Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, joins me now. He'll, of course, be in the Trump administration in short order. General Kellogg, this preemptive strike against Iran, apparently many sources say Biden did not greenlight it. They don't expect to attack Iranian nuclear sites. But nevertheless, I mean, the fact that it was even discussed, maybe wait for the professionals to come in, professionals like you, General Kellogg?
Yeah, well, Kaylee, thanks for having me tonight. It's good to be with you. And before we go, look, I want to send my condolences to those we lost down in New Orleans, the dead and the wounded, and also the great first responders we saw films of the police running towards the gunfire immediately. It was a great example of American heroism at work. Look, these are just words. Nothing's going to happen with Iran. They're not going to do anything. this administration won't do anything in the near term. You know, words as much as weapons do shape history. And what we're seeing a president who talks a lot, but doesn't have the will to do anything about it. And it shapes history in a negative way. Remember, he's the same individual who said when the Russians were getting ready to invade egregiously into Ukraine, said, well, maybe a minor incursion will be okay. Well, Putin's definition of a minor incursion is significantly different than mine. But this is also, when you think back on what is going to happen on the 20th of January, we're going to get somebody back who's resetting American dominance in the world for the American people. And it's going to be important. You know, I remember, Kayleigh, when the last State of the Union in February of 2020, when the president stood in the well of the House and he made the comment, if you attack an American, your life is forfeit. And 8 months later, we had an American named Phil.
So what happens when you give affirmative action benefits to someone who then struggles, right? What happens when you advance someone beyond their capabilities? What happens when you provide diversity, equity, inclusion boosts to people who then can't handle the responsibility that they are given? They get very angry and they lash out, right? We are creating people who hate us by advancing and promoting them above and beyond their abilities. Diversity, equity, inclusion equals a much more hateful and less competent society, less able to deal with things like this New Orleans attack. This is the New York Times today. Could better security have stopped the New Orleans terror attack? Other cities use dump trucks, fire engines, and other barriers to protect their streets. 5 years before a man in a pickup mowed down dozens of New Year revelers in New Orleans. Confidential security report warned that the iconic Bourbon Street tourist strip was vulnerable to a vehicular ramming attack. The assessment was prepared by a security firm in November 2019 for the group that manages the city's French Quarter. Did you see that elderly, frail, out-of-it woman who is the New Orleans Police Department chief? I mean, that's absurd. Right, this report warned that the bollards designed to block vehicles from entering Bourbon Street did not appear to work and that they should be fixed immediately. This is 2019. They're still not fixed. They're still not working. There were none out there when this attack happened. Right. New Orleans and its police department left Bourbon Street dangerously vulnerable. Right. Other cities take far more measures to block vehicles from crashing into buildings and pedestrians. Right. So New Orleans knew it had a problem for over 5 years, and rather than fix the problem, they just essentially ignored it. And when we promote people above and beyond their level of competence, we are incentivizing them to become filled with hatred for us and to very likely, some of them turn into terrorists.
Philip Watson, who was a farmer in Niger.
Do you think that this New Orleans terrorist, do you think that he got his positions of responsibility, that he was advanced as he was in his career solely on merit? I don't think so. I suspect that he took massive advantage of the affirmative action con, that he was playing the diversity, equity, and inclusion game, was advanced above and beyond his capabilities, and therefore developed a hatred for America.
Was kidnapped by bandits, not by terrorists. And we sent SEAL Team 6 all the way across the Atlantic into Niger to get Philip Watson back. We did. We killed all 7 bandits. That's when words really do matter. That's when a president's words really matter. And you're going to see that with this reset, and I will call it an American reset, that you're going to see on the 20th of January. And then when it comes to the Middle East, people should understand, whether you like it or not, you're both going to fear and respect the United States of America. And it's just not going to be in the Middle East. It's going to be globally as well. So the sooner this administration...
So there was an Orthodox Jewish professor at Bar-Ilan University about a decade or two ago said that there's only one solution to terrorism. That is, you have to retaliate against the female members of the terrorist family and extended family, that will stop terrorism right there. And he was severely punished, and he was disinvited from any speaking gigs, and he was abused, and he was put down, and he was made the object of stigma But in the United States, in particular, we have this individualist mentality where we think, oh, only the individual who commits a horrible deed like this particular terrorist, only he is responsible for his actions. But that's not how the world works. The world works in corporate ways. I am a reflection, whether I want to or not, of my family, of my community, of my tribe. Right? The world thinks corporately. The world thinks, there's a Jew, there's a Muslim, there's a black man, there's a homosexual, there's a Christian, there's a white man. Right? And perhaps we need to start introducing corporate group level punishments when you have groups that enable terror attacks. For example, there was a mosque in Century City that was played a key role in the 9/11 attacks. And now I assume we're going to find out that there were mosques and Islamic leaders who played a key role in developing this terrorist who slaughtered 15 people in New Orleans. So look at the chat. Yes, I do stream on Odyssey. I stream simultaneously on DLive, on X, on Rumble, on YouTube, and on Odyssey.
Packs its bags, walks out the door on the 20th. I think it's going to be a lot better for America.
No doubt. And you mentioned the words matter. Our adversaries heard the words of President Trump. Actions matter, too. And I mean, this was, as I pointed.
Remember all the Islamic terror attacks in 2014, 2015, 2016, and how they basically ceased once Donald Trump took office for his first term. And a very similar thing went on in Israel. When Israel had a center-left government, there was a massive increase in Islamic terror. When Bibi Netanyahu was prime minister, right, there usually was quite a decrease in Islamic terror, at least until October 7th of 2023. But do you remember all the terror attacks in 2014, 2015, 2016 from Muslims and how they ceased after Trump was elected, and how Black Lives Matter, right, dialed it down during Donald Trump's first term until George Floyd's death, and then they dialed it down just before the election because there was increasing evidence that Black Lives Matter terrorism was pushing the election in Donald Trump's direction for 2020. So I don't expect outbursts of terror from Black Lives Matter once Donald Trump takes office for a second time, and I don't expect a massive outburst in Islamic terror once Trump takes office.
It out, one of the deadliest Islamic terrorist attack inspired by ISIS on our soil. And what did Biden do today? He gave that medal to Liz Cheney. Our own Britt Hume said this is repulsive. That investigation, speaking of the J6 committee, was done by a committee, all of whose members were chosen by Nancy Pelosi, was produced.
Right. Think about how much attention the January 6th riot received from the news media compared to the threat of Islamic terror. And none of the January 6th rioters killed anyone. But Islamic terrorists sure do.
It's like a TV show. There was no cross-examination of witnesses. The media fell for it, but it was utterly one-sided, a show trial. So why today? I mean, our adversaries are watching, General Kellogg. Does Biden do this instead of addressing the American people, put out a picture from the Situation Room, show that you're engaged? I think that's what President Trump would have done.
Yeah, Kayleigh, but what you're seeing right now is basically our allies and our adversaries as well. They've kind of written this administration off. And you can see that with the respect that President Trump is getting from allies and adversaries as well. Look, when he went to Notre Dame in Paris when they reopened it, look what the reception that he got. It was an incredible reception. The world's leaders said, okay, this is the new American president. Now, he can't take over the presidency until the 20th of January. But people are already understanding and respecting who he's going to be when 20 January comes. And I think that's good for America. It's good for, not only the future of America, but what America stands for. Back in the day, in the Roman Empire, if you were civis Romanus, a citizen of Rome, you strode the world without fear.
I remember the Russians had someone taken captive, I believe, in Lebanon couple of decades ago, and then they started removing body parts from supporters of the kidnappers, and they got their kidnapped soldier back pretty quickly.
It's going to come back, and when you are civis Americanus, it's going to be the same way with President Trump starting on 20 Jan.
Well, we cannot wait for the professionals to come in. Professionals like you, General Kellogg.
So when America is attacked by non-citizens, non-citizens have no rights in the United States, right? We shouldn't be squeamish with regard to how we treat non-citizens who are committing acts of terror. This particular New Orleans terrorist was an American citizen. So in that circumstance, right, one would need to be observant of the law. But there are no laws protecting non-American citizens and how America treats them.
Been deported.
Look, we know that administrations, university administrators, are advising foreign students to get into the country before the 20th of January, to be here as facts on the ground in case the incoming Trump administration makes radical moves against foreign-born students or students who are here on student visas. That's part of what I am talking about. I understand why they're doing it. I understand what they think they're doing. If they think as a practical political matter that is a wise public relations strategy to have the American people believe that the higher educational sector in the United States is a net contributor to domestic tranquility and positive outcomes in the United States, that they are making a priority out of protecting foreign students from the duly elected government of the United States, enforcing our own laws about what you can and cannot do as a visitor to this country. I mean, that just accelerates the thing that I'm talking about, which is that the people from the center to the left in the United States, an almost stark reversal to what happened at the end of 2016, the beginning of 2017, are pushing themselves out of common discourse, right? In 2017, Trump faced a phalanx of opposition that was pretty centrist. I mean, or
I'm happy just to follow the evidence. All right, if there's evidence that white nationalists pose a greater threat to the United States, then I'd want law enforcement to place more attention on what's going on with white nationalists. If Islamic terrorists pose a greater threat, then send the attention there. Michael Schellenberger, for 4 years, the FBI said the threat of terrorism from white supremacists exceeded that from radicalized Muslim, but the data never supported the claim. And now the New Year's terrorist attack gives ammunition to the push for sweeping reform of our politically corrupt FBI. Democrats weaponize FBI to falsely claim white supremacists pose greater terror threat than radical Islamists. Right? There's never any evidence that right-wing political violence was increasing. So let's just follow the evidence, right? I'm happy whatever direction the evidence sends us. I'm happy to abide by it. So yeah, this former Army IT specialist who killed 15 with his truck in New Orleans early on New Year's Day. He seems to have been inspired by ISIS, and this may come as a surprise to millions of Americans because for the last 4 years, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, President Joe Biden, and other United States agencies that constitute the intelligence community have emphasized that the greatest threat of terrorism comes from white supremacists, not radicalized Islamists. Right? DVEs, domestic violent extremists. That's according to FBI Director Christopher Wray. Joe Biden, terrorism from white supremacy is the most lethal threat to the homeland today. Not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, white supremacists. And Christopher Wray, FBI, says racially motivated violent extremism, meaning white nationalism, is the biggest chunk of our domestic terrorism portfolio. These are the people who have been responsible for the most lethal attacks over the past decade. Well, the evidence has never supported these claims, right? When you compare it to the death toll from Islamic terror, right? We're talking about 3,100 dead Americans since 9/11 due to Islamic terror, and perhaps 70 to 100 killed by white nationalists.
Or wasn't radical. It was, we don't like you. You didn't win the majority of the vote. We don't like the way you talk about things. 3.5 million people are going to, protest your inauguration. And when you announce the Muslim ban, we're going to have 1 million people at airports having protests. Now, and that was a kind of wake-up call to Trump and the Republicans that maybe they needed to slow their roll a little bit and not be so radical at the outset. I think we're in a reverse position here where we are seeing behavior that is putting the non-Trump part of the American political sphere outside the common conversation about what to do on these matters, including domestically or locally. If you only take the city that Abe and I live in, right, these horrifying subway crimes.
Right, protecting Americans from illegal immigrants, protecting Americans from Islamic crime, from white nationalist crime. You'd think that would be a higher priority than trying to transform societies in the Middle East and make them more liberal and democratic and Western. Right? How about we focus our attentions on making America safer?
You have the Democratic governor of New York State praising herself for really taking tough measures to secure things on the subway 2 hours after a woman is set on fire on a train. And one sign of potential health for Democrats in this realm is that Richie Torres, the congressman from Queens, who was clearly going to make a run for.
Okay, I like the direction of this latest Fox News program. So now they're going to talk about media malpractice, and the cover-up of Joe Biden's obvious senility for the past 7 years is a huge malpractice.
From President Biden's declining health to the raging crisis on our southern border, the media gave cover to Democrats and helped brush aside some of their largest blunders until they just simply could not ignore them anymore. But now that their party was completely rejected by the American people, the left is finally admitting that they were wrong and Donald Trump was right. One of Biden's favorite shows is now finally being honest about his failures.
The border was not Biden's finest moment, frankly. You can see what happened here. And Trump is not wrong when he talks about how border crossings were quite low. They were running about 74,000 a month when he left office. And they, in fact, did shoot up. Some of it was some things Biden said and some ways that they put a moratorium, for example, on deportations. But in fact, we did get up here almost to 300,000 a month.
And the raging Cajun is reflecting on all the ways that his party failed in 2024. James Carville writing, quote, "I keep coming back to the same thing. We lost for one very simple reason. It is, and it always will be the economy, stupid. We have to begin 2025 with that truth as our political North Star and not get distracted by anything else. To Democratic presidential hopefuls, your auditions for 2028 should be based on two things. Number one, how authentic you are on the economy. And number two, how well you deliver it on a podcast." Virginia Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears joins me now. Lieutenant Governor, always a pleasure to speak with you.
Okay, let's get back to this Commentary Magazine discussion.
Governor in 2026 against Kathy Hochul, who's the one I'm talking about, is like going at her jugular on Twitter.
So a point that I go back to again and again, it's boring that Republicans stand for more law enforcement, for stricter punishment for violent criminals than do Democrats, right? So people who are cutting edge and really good at manipulating attention, such as Richard Spencer and Nick Fuentes, they say, don't vote for Donald Trump, right? Republicans are boring. There's nothing exciting about them. But to the man, right? Every Republican politician of whom I'm aware stands for more law enforcement, for stricter punishment than do Democrats. The only politicians who support capital punishment, to the best of my knowledge, are Republicans. We know that the overwhelming majority of violent crimes are just committed by a tiny number of people, right? As soon as they commit a crime and we know it and we convict them, they just got to be put away for a long, long time. And that then changes all sorts of calculations that people make. It allows people to open up more to strangers. It allows people to feel more at ease. It promotes greater social cohesion and social trust. It massively improves the quality of life. And it's so simple, right? We simply arrest and prosecute and put away for a long time people who commit violent crime. It's boring. It's not edgy. It's not exciting. It's not going to break live streaming records. But so much of the most important truths and so many of the most important things that we can do to make our world just a little bit better. Really boring, simple, obvious. You find the bad guys, you prosecute them, and you put them away for a long time. And Republicans, conservatives, people on the right are far more supportive of strict penalties for those who commit violent crime compared to Democrats. And they have far fewer apprehensions about calling it out, naming it, identifying it, recognizing that not only do different people have different gifts, but different peoples also pose varying levels of threat. And it's really hard to solve a problem if you can't come out and describe exactly what it is.
Every 3 hours, every time she opens her mouth, because he is saying, far from securing people are getting increasingly afraid to use public transportation in the United States, and for good reason, and in New York. And Democrats seem unable to adjust their priorities to face the actual conditions of the moment.
I think a lot of it has to do with the politics of their own constituency groups. And this may be a good segue to talk about the other incident on New Year's Day, which was this.
Right. So if your group commits a disproportionate amount of crime, right, you may well have opposition to strict punishment for crime, because that means a lot more members of your group will be away in prison. So different groups not only commit different levels of crime, different groups have different appetites for different levels of law enforcement and punishment for violent criminals.
Cybertruck explosion outside the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas. The videos are circulating on social media. Here, of course, the Cybertruck, or as Elon Musk calls it, just Cybertruck.
Right. Incarceration changes the facts on the ground, as the chat notes. It's so simple. It's so boring, but it's the most obvious thing that improves the quality of life and the safety for your average fellow citizen. And if that's important to you, then vote Republican.
Seems to have saved the day by containing the explosion to such an extent that the doors of the Trump Hotel remained intact. The only person who died was the driver of the truck. We're just beginning to get some information about him, as Christine pointed out. But the obvious symbolism of this act of political violence, blowing up a Cybertruck, which was Elon Musk's company, in front of the Trump Hotel, and some of the photos online, you'll see. I mean, it's like a allegory for.
So who votes Republican? All right, the most patriotic Americans, right? The people who love this country the most, the people most likely to serve in its military, right? The people who are most likely to cry at the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner, the people who show the most respect towards the flag and towards our history and towards our institutions, right? These are overwhelmingly Republicans. It's the coalition to the fringe that has far more negative views about this country, displays far less respect for this country's history and symbols, are far less inclined to serve in the U.S. military. Much of the Democratic Party of the fringe, including a substantial, right, there are substantial sectors that are key to the Democratic Party who overwhelmingly loathe this country. Do not sacrifice for this country. Do not serve in the U.S. military. Right. So the burning core, the white Christian core of this country loves this country, and many of those on the fringe hate this country. Those American citizens who hate this country are probably 5-1 more likely to vote for the Democrats. And those Americans who get married, have kids, and contribute far more in taxes than they take out in welfare payments, these people are overwhelmingly voting Republican. Right? The people who love this country and sacrifice for this country and contribute to this country are overwhelmingly Republican. And those people who kneecap this country and who suck on the teat of the public welfare state and don't contribute. Instead, they are a net detriment to the economy, the culture, the welfare, the common good of this country. They overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, right? The people who are burning down American cities and committing massive amounts of crime in the name of Black Lives Matter, these were not people who voted Republican.
For simpletons, because the Trump name, of course, is right there all in gold, and the Cybertruck is, you can still see it because it's so tough, as Elon said, you have it right there. So the specter of political violence, left-wing political violence directed against this president-elect, it continues to haunt us. And while authorities seem to be exploring some potential circumstantial...
So during Trump's first inauguration, right, there was massive amounts of violence committed by Democrats. They wreaked havoc in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. government and law enforcement is controlled by Democrats, and these thugs and terrorists were overwhelmingly not punished. The thugs and terrorists who disrupted education at America's leading universities, supporting Islamic terror, right, they overwhelmingly also escaped punishment. It's Republicans who want to punish terrorists and criminals, and the criminally violent in particular. Republicans want to punish those who are trying to tear down and destroy our culture, our safety, our civilization. Democrats want to minimize or completely skip punishing terrorists and their accomplices.
Connections between the attack in New Orleans and the explosion in Las Vegas, we don't know the truth, but we do know, we can say that Donald Trump remains the target of left-wing political actors. And of course, the most infamous act of left-wing political violence in recent years happened last month on the streets of New York City. And what did we have there? We had Democratic elected officials like AOC and Senator Elizabeth Warren essentially trying to explain the murderers.
And Bernie Sanders.
And Bernie Sanders, trying to explain the murderer's motivation. So that the Democrats have a problem on multiple bases.
It wasn't Republicans who were giddy about the murder of that healthcare CEO, right? That healthcare CEO was not a horrible person killing thousands of Americans. Even if you think that his healthcare company was a bad company, it was operating with the incentives created by our system. It wasn't his fault that our healthcare is so deeply flawed. And incidentally, most people like their health insurance plan, right? Most Americans don't hate their health insurance plan. And the only people of which I'm aware who celebrated and were giddy and joyous over that assassination were on the left.
Within their coalition, that they find themselves always trying to have no enemies to the left, or actually sympathizing with the aims of the radicals and trying to apologize or explain for them, whether it's Hamasniks or whether it's people who gun down fathers of two because of their job. This is a problem that I think is only going to grow worse as Trump ascends to the White House once again.
Yeah, and part of that is that there's a, we could talk about sort of the homegrown extremism problem, which I think that that's another conversation we need to be having now, which is that, like, my first reaction to the terrorist attack was, this guy was radicalized and he didn't even go to Columbia. Like, we have like radicalization factories. And what do people think this all looks like in 10 years when you shuffle through the people who are...
We have one highly productive and relatively free country in the Middle East, right? We have one functioning democracy with the rule of law, Israel. We have one country in the Middle East that makes technological advances, medical advances, cultural advances, who is on the cutting edge of all sorts of sectors of the world's economy and science and learning and culture and entertainment, right? It's Israel. And pretty much the rest of the Middle East contributes nothing to the world beyond some natural resources, right? There's not a lot of cutting edge technology coming out of Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Iran, right? There's only one country in the Middle East that is consistently contributing to the world and advancing science, advancing medicine, advancing technology, advancing learning and culture and morality, right? It's the Jewish state, and its enemies are backwards, barbaric regimes, overwhelmingly, that you would never want to spend any time in.
are going to be, presumably who are, in these colleges who will then go on to be law clerks for Supreme Court justices and whatever, and top law firms and all this stuff. We know they're sort of on a path to being prominent in whatever industry they have. That's the whole point, really, of getting the leg up of an Ivy League degree. What do we think that looks like when the public sort of almost establishment, in a way, has been sort of groomed to be radicalized in this way? And one thing,
Elon Musk is flawed. Donald Trump is flawed. I'm flawed. All right. Elon Musk has elements of the con man in him. He is crude at times. He is careless in things he posts, but he is a man of vast accomplishment. Right? He has built up things that have dramatically improved the American economy and improved our ability to speak freely on these controversial issues. Right? We have far less restriction and censorship on YouTube and on Facebook and on other social media due to Elon Musk taking over the platform Twitter and making it, though flawed, still a bastion of free speech overall. So we have persons who make enormous contributions, and then a lot of people on the distant right just want to throw them in the trash because they're wrong about this issue or they've exaggerated about this or that. You have to recognize that everyone's got a bank account, right? Everyone is either contributing or taking away from our culture and our economy. And some people have made enormous deposits in their moral bank account, to use Dennis Prager terminology, and other people are just massively overdrawn in their moral bank account. And Elon Musk is a massive contributor to the United States of America, for all his flaws.
Thing that keeps coming up in my head is, Peter Bergen, the CNN national security analyst. He was the first to interview bin Laden or something. So he's been on that beat probably longer than anybody. And he wrote a book at some point about 10 years ago about domestic extremism and this, domestic radicalization called American Jihad. And he says in it.
Okay, talking about sex spam on X. Yes, I would prefer that people should have to sign up on the internet to get access to pornography. So I would prefer no sex porn spam on X, right? Elon Musk's platform is imperfect. I wish it would change, but overall it has massively improved the functional amount of free speech that we can have on these controversial cutting edge issues since Elon Musk took it over.
And he's talking about why Americans join these, ISIS and these other groups. And at one point, he quotes a political scientist who says that there have been 4 waves of global revolutionary terrorism in the past century or so. He says the first was the anarchist wave. The next was the anti-colonial wave. The third was the new left wave in the 60s. We've been talking about that a lot lately, obviously, the Weather Underground. And the fourth and final was the religious violence phase that began in 79 with the Iranian Revolution. Now, if you look at that list and you take it seriously, we sort of have a merging of 3 and 4. This is a very worrisome thing, right? We have a sort of new left
and one
merging
and one, because Luigi Mangione is much more.
So I notice among friends and acquaintances of mine who loathe Donald Trump, they were increasingly talking at times about going out and setting off bombs and committing acts of terror because they hated Donald Trump that much. I didn't hear the same thing from my Donald Trump supporting or my Republican voting friends. I don't recall any of them ever suggesting that they'd want to go out and commit acts of terror if Joe Biden won the election.
Part of the first, the act of shooting an industrialist on a street, that is like the late 19th century terrorist wave.
And if the second of the 4 was anti-colonial, then that's where we're at. So I think that we're seeing whether it's true that these are the specific, they can be chopped up into 4 eras of political terrorism like that. The point is we're sort of seeing like a giant chullent of extremism in America. Everything's being thrown into one pot and is stewing there. And I think that we're underestimating the effect.
So in general, the people who hate Israel also hate America. There are exceptions, so I'm not going to stand here and make the case that Israel is America's greatest ally. I don't want America subsidizing Israel. I don't want America just giving to Israel. I want America to align its foreign policy on the basis of what's good for America, not on the basis of what's good for the Jewish state. But there do seem to be some common trends that the groups who loathe the Jewish state and want to destroy it are also the groups that want to destroy America as we know it. And those Americans who are most willing to sacrifice for America, who most contribute to America, they also tend to have, on average, a more positive than negative view of the one state in the Middle East that is making scientific, technological, and cultural contributions to the world.
On public safety and the public discourse and, establishment style politics in the somewhat near future.
Well, we talk about radicalization on college campuses. It's almost exactly the opposite what we've had over.
It wouldn't shock me. And we do see it in the distant right, many people converting to Islam, right? Many of the people who got excited by Richard Spencer and Nick Fuentes and other alt-right posters have either converted to Islam or thought about converting to Islam or have considerable sympathy for terrorists, either of the white nationalist or Islamic varieties. Right? There is a substantial amount of either moral confusion or nihilism or just general dysfunction that pervades our most eloquent and captivating, attention-grabbing dissident right streamers such as Nick Fuentes and Richard Spencer.
Over the last year is not the radicalization of the conversation on college campuses, but the mainstreaming of that radical conversation. So now it's okay to have been in an encampment. Now it's maybe...
Right. So there are all sorts of different attitudes towards Jews on the distant right, but the most dysfunctional members of the distant right tend to have the most rabid hatred of Jews, and the most functional members of the distant right tend to have the least rabid hatred of Jews. So to be on the distant right and go out and convert to Islam is just an obvious example of dysfunction. I mean, how many people, right, lead an impressive life after they convert to Islam? I'm sure there are some, but that's not the trajectory that I'm familiar with.
Cool to have been in an encampment. Obviously, the encampments haven't returned to campuses per se, but yesterday on New Year's Day in New York, there was a Globalize the Intifada march thing going on. So what would people like us?
That goes on your resume. You used to tell people to volunteer at a hospital when you were in high school. Now it's like find an Intifada, protest to go to and put that on your resume.
Right. So one of the reasons that this case, the Jabbar case, is so complicated is obviously precisely because he is a native-born American citizen and therefore has the rights of native-born American, all the constitutional protections afforded. I mean, he's dead, but I mean, by which I mean that it's not so easy to blame. And then you have this question of, well, if there are others like him, what modality do we have to fight them in the after 9/11?
And perhaps the worst thing about this New Orleans terror attack is that more Americans and more people in the first world will develop fearful or skeptical or even hostile reactions to people with intensely Islamic names like Jabbar or Hussein or Barak.
9/11, there was a huge amount of controversy about using surveillance techniques to try to figure out what kind of threats America was under. And it was very...
So many of the big Islamic attacks on America have been aided by connections that these terrorists have made in mosques. So maybe we should be up in all the mosques with listening devices. Maybe that would help us to get a jump on these terror attacks.
Clear, though you would not know this from the way it was discussed, that the Bush administration was trying to make it clear that no American citizen was being surveilled under the warrantless wiretapping. So this was all about getting information from abroad, from people who did not have these constitutional protections. Well, what do we do if we have a wave of homegrown terrorist extremism that is now emerging in the form of Luigi Mangione, in the form of Sham Jabbar, in the form of the Cybertruck guy? Because we have all kinds of things that we can do now that we couldn't do 20 years ago. There is facial recognition software. There is AI, deployment of AI in the use of facial recognition software. We could go through a crowd of the Globalize the Intifada march on January.
I am for more surveillance in public spaces and the use of facial recognition. I think that there are signs that people give off before they do horrible things. You can't just go into some mass casualty terrorist event in a state of equanimity and joy, right? People will have all sorts of physical expressions of grave distress and stress and anxiety and psyching themselves up before they commit these terror attacks. So let's have more facial surveillance, right? Let's have systems that are automatically pairing faces with what we know about these individuals, get the facial recognition operating. Because if you're a law-abiding citizen, you're not going to be harmed by facial recognition software as you walk down a public street. But those who are a danger, let's get them surveilled. Let's get them identified. Let's start watching them. Let's have more live cam facial recognition software operating in public spaces.
January 1st in New York City and get 5,000 photographs of people and figure out who 50 to 60% of them are, even if they're masked, right? Can we do that? What's the American response?
It's usually a worrying sign when someone converts to Islam, right? It's a scream that I am dysfunctional, and because I'm dysfunctional, I'm also likely a danger to people around me. Right? America should have grave concern when people convert to Islam, because so many of those who commit these horrible behaviors are converts to Islam. And we don't have an impressive track record of people converting to Islam and then making major contributions to our country.
Response going to be if we have a wave of this?
Look, technologically, we can do. Jabbar posted a video before his attack, saying he was going to kill people for ISIS or whatever his particular message was. Right? Perhaps he was doing that on the drive from Texas to Louisiana. It was one of the accounts that I read. Conceivably, in terms of technology, couldn't AI grab that threat, track where it came from, and have actually had a beat on the guy before he got there? I mean,
well, we don't know.
The legal complications
are staggering.
Yes,
and as I say, imagine that we had this capability right after 9/11.
But I think one of the lessons of 9/11 is that you can have, or even all the lessons of October 7th, you can have remarkable technology, but you still rely on humans to enforce the law, and humans make mistakes and suffer these heuristic biases that we started off the show talking about. So even in this scenario, you would still have to rely on human beings on the ground. Let's not forget that one of the reasons that he was able to commit this atrocity was the barriers. I forget the name. Bollards. Thank you. The bollards on Bourbon Street have been in disrepair, apparently for months, if not years.
Well, they're being replaced. There's some kind of street work being done.
Well, New Orleans government and New Orleans PD is disproportionately operated along the lines of affirmative action, not merit. So I guess we can't be too surprised by the lack of competence there.
Yeah, but
it meant they had to be removed.
They've known about this problem for a long time, and there's
why they parked a cop car there that he drove around to get to Bourbon Street. Yeah,
right. So because the bollards were inactive for months, the cops, the police, put in their vehicles to block the street, but still left room for him to get around and drive on the sidewalk and commit the mass murder. So there are different levels of failure here, but to me, the most striking is the bollards, because at the end of the day, you can't really count on the New Orleans government for efficiency in repair or getting to make sure that the AI agent, as soon as they alert the authorities, is going to be on top of it. I mean, this is human failure here. And so
Democratic presidents from Obama to Biden didn't like to talk about Islamic terrorism, and in the UK, nobody in the political establishment wanted to talk about Pakistani grooming gangs.
London here in Tel Aviv. And I woke up this morning to the quite astonishing result of Elon Musk picking up Tommy's case really vigorously. And not just Tommy's case, not just Tommy Robinson being in prison, but the entire backstory of why Tommy is in prison. Now, okay, it's a libel trial, a contempt of court case, all of this other nonsense that they used to put Tommy in prison. And every other time he's been put in prison since he began his activism, it's all been trumped up charges and pretenses. A mortgage fraud case that was ridiculous, going to America without a visa, everything you can imagine as a reason to put him in prison. But the reason he was put in prison was because he was drawing attention to something that the establishment, the oligarchy, does not want anyone to hear about, which is the epidemic of Muslim rape gangs that's been going on in the UK since the late 80s. At the kind of earliest reports are clearly in the late.
Not all groups commit rape and commit murder at identical rates, right? Some groups are highly unlikely to commit rape and murder, and other groups commit rape and murder at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times the average rate. So you would think that this basic awareness of group differences should be just part of ordinary conversation and should be a bedrock piece of reality that was discussed in academia and in elite circles, in the news, right? You'd think that truth is good, and realizing that different groups commit rape and murder at very different rates should be something that we would pay some attention to.
Late 80s, when a group of Sikhs didn't like their daughters being attacked by Muslim gangs, and they fought a pitched battle in a curry restaurant with swords, apparently, that made the news, the sort of local news, but it's been ongoing since then. I want to just talk about one specific aspect of how the cover-up was achieved that very, very few people understand. And this is to do with the way the court system works. And this impacted...
All right, this is Brian of London speaking from Tel Aviv. He's a base Jew.
Tommy directly, because he was sent to prison twice for trying to do a better job at reporting the convictions and the trials of rape gangs. What used to happen in Britain, I'm talking way back to the 80s, pre-internet. And
so the British legal system and political system was far more interested in putting someone in prison for talking about Muslim rape gangs as opposed to stopping and prosecuting Muslim rape gangs.
This is across the world, really. There used to be things called local newspapers, where local reporters would be assigned to be a court reporter. And the local reporter would sit in the local courts and listen to cases as they were heard. Now, in Britain, you're not really, there's very strict restrictions on how you report cases. But if you sit in a court with a jury and you hear everything that the jury hears, at the end of the day, you can go out and you can write anything that you heard in the court. And at the end of the report, all you have to do is say, the case continues. The defendant is pleading not guilty and the case continues. That's it. That was the reporting restrictions. Anything you heard in court that day could be repeated. If a witness said that a Muslim man had done some terrible things to her, or the police testified that they'd found this and that, you could write all of that down. And what would happen with a long and complicated case involving horrible circumstances would be that generally reporters, local reporters, would follow the case day by day. Every day they would put out a new report. Into the case today, we heard this. And this could go on for weeks. And at the end, there would be a verdict, and that would be reported as well. But you'd have this background of daily reports that you could refer back to understand how a conviction was achieved. But what started happening, and very clearly happened with the kind of late stage, once the EDL had started marching, Once the topic was brought to the fore, once Andrew Norfolk had been almost shamed into writing something about a topic he knew was happening, which were these Muslim rape gangs in predominantly Muslim areas, once he had been shamed into writing it by the fact of Tommy Robinson leading hordes of men onto streets in northern and...
So in a healthy society, a tiny minority group would be afraid to develop rape gangs because they knew that the consequences, not just to themselves, but to their community, would be intense. Right? This is why we need to stop thinking purely in individualist terms, and to more effectively combat terror and rape gangs, think in corporate terms.
Muslim area towns with big Muslim populations. Once all of that had happened, these cases started to come up slowly, and then more and more, 2013 and so on. But what the authorities did not want is a big case with 15 defendants and then daily reporting of everything that was said in the trial, all of those details that you're now starting to see. And you're seeing the tiny, teeny tip of an iceberg, because very little of this got out. So how was this suppressed? Well, by the mid-2013s, 14s, local journalism had been almost wiped out by the internet. Facebook, Google, eBay, Craigslist, all of these systems had meant local advertising dried up. So the local newspapers dried up. So the ability to send a court reporter into a court case every single day had largely dried up. Citizen journalism hadn't quite sprung up to meet it. Tommy really wasn't a journalist back in those earliest days. He became one later with the help of rebel media. But their government did something else. And now the way the British government...
So I'm not some unabashed fan of Tommy Robinson. He deserves a ton of accurate criticism, right? But it should be placed in context with the enormous amount of good that he does raising important issues.
Exerts control is very sneaky. They impressed upon the judiciary and the Crown Prosecution Service that these cases were often like massive. So you might have 40 or something defendants, because you'd be rolling up a significant proportion of Muslim men in a community, because it was uncles and brothers and fathers all taking part in the same horror.
So when Los Angeles was operating a gang index, keeping track of everyone who belonged in a gang, it was at a point where half of the young black male population in Los Angeles was part of a criminal gang. And an enormous number of young Muslim men and middle-aged Muslim men in certain British communities were also part of a horrific criminal enterprise.
So you can't rely totally on
it's
technology. You have to take
than
a more proactive human, I think, action and direction.
But one of the reasons why I think there is this idea that this was a significant conspiracy is, how did he know to go to New Orleans? Was there some knowledge in New Orleans that there was a way around the cop car and there were no bollards and you could do a car ramming? Car rammings there were 2 of them in Europe in the last 6 months, right? There was the Christmas market in Germany where
in the past several years, they've emerged in Europe as a regular threat.
Yeah, and
there was one in New York 10 years ago or so.
There was, well, more than that, 15, on West Street. Like, this is a very effective form of mass killing.
And there was one in Israel 2 weeks ago also.
Well, Israel is...
So we've had a substantial increase of Muslim immigration into Southern California, and a really big increase in the number of people who are fully decked out in the most intense Muslim regalia possible. And it's just another thing that is reducing the desire of many Los Angelenos to go to shopping centers, because they turn up at a shopping center and it looks like it's Sharia day and they don't feel comfortable there. So sad that they experience this Islamophobia.
This is just another example, by the way, of these things that they sort of get practiced on Israelis, and then they go global. These forms of attacks.
Okay, I want to move. I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to move. Part of this discussion of whether or not, we are willing to look at this square in the face, and what kinds of efforts are made to make it difficult for us to have honest discussions of the threat posed, say, by Islamist terrorism. Is we are having a resurgence over the last 2 or 3 weeks of the assault on Israel's efforts to extirpate Hamas in Gaza, both by international organizations, meaning these genocide reports and various other things, and then this story about how now it's wet and there's flooding and it's wet in Gaza, and the Israelis are going through and trying to get Hamas terrorists in the north.
So the people of Gaza overwhelmingly supported Hamas, according to different opinion polls, and so they corporately, as a group, will have to bear the price of supporting and enabling Hamas. And so there's a time and a place to think of people as individuals, but it's not how the mind works, right? If you are a Jew, you don't think of individual Christians, you think of Christians. If you're a Christian, you don't think of individual Jews generally, you think of Jews. If you're Muslim, you don't think of individual Jews and Muslims, Jews and Christians, you think of, he's a Jew, he's a Christian, right? He's black, he's gay, he's white. We experience life overwhelmingly on a corporate level, and always trying to go back to the liberal ideal of individualism. There are many beauties to that, but no one narrative, no one system is sufficient for all the complexities of life. And most of the world operates on a group basis, and most of the time a group strategy will outcompete an individualist strategy. I think we need to become more corporate in how we deal with many of these attacks on our society.
Around Jabalia, and there should be an immediate ceasefire, because really, how much more can they do? How much more can they do? Israel's terrible. It's doing terrible things. It's monstrous. None of these people.
Elliot Blatt is praising Amazon Prime right now. I just saw something incredibly exciting on Amazon Prime Video. They've got an entire channel just devoted to the oeuvre of Tyler Perry. I mean, how exciting is that?
Say Hamas should surrender. Hamas should nothing. If Hamas surrenders, Israel isn't doing anything. The aid is still being stolen? The aid is sitting there rotting, at the Kerem Shalom crossing, all of that, and Israel's getting blamed and blamed and blamed. Why do I bring this up? Because it's when the New York Times, in particular, stresses that as the issue when you have a democratic country invaded by a terrorist entity next door that it is continuing to battle with 100 hostages whom it is not freeing, and that even though it is headless and shapeless and seems to be directionless, will not give up the ghost. And if the liberal conversation about this is Israel is getting bad, is worse, Israel is worse, Israel is worse, what kind of effect does that have on the way they think about what goes on inside of the readers of this most important news organization on the planet Earth, the 10 million people who subscribe to the New York Times now? What effect does that have on where they focus their attention in terms of, because the threat to Israel from Hamas is the threat to New Orleans from Sham Jabbar. I mean, it is the same threat. It's an open society being attacked essentially from within, kind of semi from within.
This was the whole point of the Intifada, right? I mean, I know some people were saying this is what globalized the Intifada means, and other people were saying, well, this is the difference. That's the difference. The main point is that, the point of the Intifada was to make you afraid to go to, your local bar, to Mike's in Tel Aviv or wherever, afraid to go to the show.
And if we don't punish violent criminals, right, people will increasingly withdraw from public life. If we don't get a handle on immigration, people will increasingly withdraw from public life because they feel nothing in common with other people in public spaces, right? They will feel an increasing sense of threat and alienation. And so people will lead smaller and smaller lives. They'll huddle closer and closer just to their own group and reduce civic participation. So as we have become more diverse, that means the less we have in common, which means the less we have in common with other people, the more we fear them, the more predisposed we are to developing negative perspectives on them and negative reactions and hostile reactions, and the more likely interactions are going to be misunderstood, meaning that there will be explosions of anger, when people get angry, they often make really bad decisions. Right? We've been burning down our society in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and oh, how wonderful it is that we have less and less in common with each other.